Hi, I'm Ken Scott, Head of Inspectorate at the Sports Grounds Safety Authority. Welcome to the Safety of Sports Grounds webinar, which focuses on the areas outside of sports grounds, the areas now commonly known as Zone X. So what do we mean by Zone X? This partial extract from the Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds, Edition 6, defines Zone X as the external zone which lies immediately beyond the outer perimeter of the sports ground, consisting of a network of routes or areas, often leading to and from transport hubs. These areas will often be areas of public realm outside of the ownership and therefore outside of the direct control of the sports ground or event organizer. This picture shows crowds being managed en route quite some distance from the London Stadium during the 2012 Olympic Games in London. So what we're discussing is not entirely new. The terminology last mile and thinking around this area was brought up to date in 2018 with the new 6th edition of the Green Guide, which introduced the term Zone X to give broader understanding and consideration of the area, which also recognized the widening global reach and impact of the Green Guide. Previous editions of the Green Guide had stopped at the perimeter of the site of the sports ground when giving advice, and were quite limited to design and management issues of the sports ground, as opposed to the consideration of those wider areas which are material to the safety of all people using the venue. So this move to advise beyond the traditional boundary was seen as being quite bold in some quarters. Why do we need to consider Zone X? Well, those working within the safety of sports grounds industry recognize that it's simply not possible to plan for a safe event without considering not just safety inside the sports ground, but also those wider external areas giving access to and from the sports ground. That is, the need to understand the interaction between the sports ground and the external environment and spectator movement characteristics. Understanding these movement patterns of spectators attending sporting events is crucial in helping to deliver the highest levels of safety. Stade de France in November 2015 and Manchester Arena in May 2017 proved the need to consider safety and security of crowds not just on entry, but also on departure. Also, consideration of Zone X is a recognition of the need to look beyond the conventional headings of safety and security to consider the spectator experience and spectator journey. Planning for a safe event can be directly linked to the spectator journey, with engagement often starting at home with notification by text or email, advising, for example, on levels of security in place for the event, expected queuing times, or any other additional areas of potential impact upon the spectator journey, such as current transport details. All of these small but significant elements add not just to the overall safety and security of the event, but also to the spectator experience of that event and likelihood of returning. In relation to outer areas of screening of fans as part of the counter-terrorism measures, these are often carried out some distance from the sports ground, and impact upon the pedestrian flow in carrying out these checks within Zone X must be understood. Education of fans is important here, particularly where high levels of security are in place. And so turning up 15 minutes before the start, which is historic for many sporting events, but still expecting to be in a seat for the start of the event, may be difficult to achieve under these circumstances. Education also needs to learn from that undertaken by the airline industry, who convinced the public to arrive 2 hours before scheduled departure to allow sufficient time to navigate the necessary security checks. So what is the extent of Zone X? Well, as previously mentioned, Green Guide 6 is breaking new ground, giving guidance beyond the traditional red line boundary around sports grounds, and was impacted upon by the events at Stade de France in 2015 and in Manchester Arena in 2017. I've already mentioned the need to consider the safety of spectators beyond that traditional boundary, both in their safe arrival, circulation, and departure. But what is the extent of Zone X? How far do these considerations need to be taken? Well, the easy one, I guess, is determining where Zone X starts, which is at the outer limits of the buffer zone outside of the sports ground, where fans traditionally will gather before entering the sports ground. Green Guide refers to this zonal area as Zone 5. The difficult one, though, is deciding where Zone X ends, as this will be different for many venues. As author of this section within the Green Guide, My intention was that it would extend to a place where spectators are no longer part of the crowd and once again become members of the general public. And as just said, this will vary considerably from venue to venue, depending upon the venue's location and external environs. This illustration shown sets out the principles of zonal movement as supported in the Green Guide, with Zone 1 showing the playing area or area of activity, Zone 2 the viewing accommodation, Zone 3 internal concourses, vomitories and hospitality areas, Zone 4 the outer circulation area, and Zone 5 the buffer zone outside of sports grounds, and Zone X is the natural extension of the Zone 5 area. Traditionally, and certainly in previous editions of the Green Guide, we focused only on the design and management of the physical mass, that is, the structure of the sports ground. However, we now recognise that other considerations necessary may include the list as set out on the screen. Worthy of particular note from this list are the event or competition overlay, and this would revolve around the consideration of any imported equipment to the external areas of the sports ground. For example, promotions taking place or broadcasting vehicles and equipment. Desire lines and movement patterns and the need to understand those desire lines or popular routes to and from the stadium and the impact that a potential imbalance in numbers arriving and departing could have upon entry and exit provision. In this area, crowd modelling can assist in evaluating potential areas of concern. The demographic of the crowd and its arrival patterns is also very important to consider. This is the need to understand the split between the age and gender and likely behaviours, and it's a key area in the design and management of Zone X. And let's not forget the real importance of good quality signage and the part that it can play in limiting the number of unnecessary movements outside of the sports ground. So how is Zone X designed and managed? Well, generally by using a range of often unconnected legislation with good helpings of spirit and cooperation to help make it work. A good plan developed and signed up by all parties will always help. The development of this plan will, I'm sure, involve some adult conversations around resourcing and responsibility, but the conversation just cannot be avoided. And the best vehicle for delivering this plan would be to use an extension of a safety advisory group, if one is already in place, which will generally contain the key players, or at the very least, the necessary conduits to those key players. The key point, though, to take away from this slide is that there is no one organisation that can make Zone X work effectively in isolation. It truly needs a collaborative team effort. So who is involved in this? Well, there is a clear demonstration of the need for and the benefits arising from partnership working. But the list as set out on this slide are key or core members whose input will be valuable in the determination of how Zone X will work or not work. The important point at the bottom is not to make it solely around the people who are deemed to be core members, but to include any others who could be seen to add material or good value to the process. How does it impact upon the General Safety Certificate? Well, in the UK, many sports grounds operate under conditions attached to a General Safety Certificate. In these cases, any certificate should not contain any conditions which are outside of the gift of the certificate holder to ensure compliance. However, external factors can become material if they impact upon the safe arrival and departure of spectators. Consider the case of Southampton Football Club, the sports ground in the picture. The sports ground has a capacity for around 32,500 people. That is, the points of entry, the number of seats, and exit provision will allow for that safe number to be accommodated. However, if the adjoining landowner was to design a moat around the stadium and fill it full of crocodiles, would 32,500 people still be a safe number to attach to the General Safety Certificate? Hopefully at this point my audience is saying, well, of course not, Ken. I'm fairly sure that crocodile-infested waters are not common in southern England, but clearly in order to achieve the sports ground safe capacity, an arrangement would need to be reached between the certificate holder and the adjoining landowner to remove or mitigate the danger to allow the maximum capacity of the sports ground to be achieved. If this can't be achieved, then the condition within the General Safety Certificate would need to reflect the numbers of spectators who could safely access the sports ground, which may be considerably less than its physical safe capacity. Perhaps though a more realistic scenario would be the need for certificate holders to secure arrangements with local highway authorities to prevent the movement of vehicles on public highways through traffic regulation orders to allow for safe access and egress on event days. So notwithstanding whether a general safety certificate is a legal requirement or not for the event organizer, the principles as just explained should still apply. And further advice on this can be found in the Sports Grounds Safety Authority's Guide to Safety Certification, which is available on the SGSA website. Many sports grounds currently can only achieve maximum safe capacities through joint working with local authorities and highways agencies who put into effect traffic regulation orders to close roads to avoid pedestrian and vehicular mix on event days. Many of the principles discussed in this webinar should already be commonplace. However, of high importance is that individual plans prepared by the different agencies should fully align with each other to ensure that there are no areas left unmanaged. Good practice would also suggest that these plans are fully tested in tabletop scenarios to ensure that they work. So in summary, the key headings from this presentation to take away with you are: first, to understand the extent and the size of the Zone X outside of your sports ground. Understand the limitations within this external area, certainly to understand the movement flow and to develop plans for the design and management of this area. Develop good, sound and solid collaborative working practices, and importantly, to recognize the potential consequences of the failure to consider all of these features within Zone X. So finally, to end, I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar and its content. But if, however, you would like to raise any issues with me on this or any other sports ground safety matters, please feel free to contact me via the SGSA website. Thanks for listening.